The crack of splintering wood echoed through the Caldwell mansion's parlor at dawn, on March 15, 1839, as Edmund Caldwell's morning devotion was interrupted, not by divine intervention, but by 18 inches of ceremonial steel that had hung above his mantle for 15 years. The sweet fragrance of magnolia blossoms drifting through open windows could not mask the copper scent that now stained the imported Turkish carpet, while the leather-bound family Bible lay open to Exodus, its pages darkening with evidence of a justice that no earthly court would ever acknowledge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. The hymn that Sofia had been forced to sing moments before still hung in the air, her voice having provided the perfect cover for footsteps that moved with the precision of someone who had memorized every creaking floorboard during 4 years of mandatory dawn worship. This is the story of how an 18-year-old woman transformed a daily ritual of psychological torment into the most shocking act of resistance in Mobile's antebellum history, and why the truth was buried so deeply beneath religious hypocrisy and social respectability that it took nearly 2 centuries to surface. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Caldwell plantation house stood like a monument to moral contradiction on the banks of the Tensaw River, its white columns gleaming in the Alabama morning sun while casting shadows that had witnessed unspeakable horrors disguised as Christian devotion. The mansion's parlor, where Edmund Caldwell conducted his daily morning prayers, featured mahogany furnishings imported from the Caribbean, crystal chandeliers that caught the light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and walls lined with religious paintings that depicted biblical scenes of suffering and redemption. The irony was lost on no one except Edmund himself. Sofia moved through these opulent rooms each morning before dawn, lighting candles and arranging the heavy wooden chairs where 52 enslaved souls would be forced to listen as their master perverted scripture to justify their bondage. The rich scent of beeswax mixed with the earthy smell of the river bottom that seeped through the mansion's foundation, while the smooth marble floors bore the invisible stains of tears shed by generations of people who had been forced to participate in their own spiritual degradation. The weapon that would deliver justice had been displayed in plain sight for 15 years, mounted above the parlor's marble fireplace like a twisted religious relic. The ceremonial hatchet, with its polished oak handle and gleaming steel blade, had been a gift from Edmund's father, inscribed with the biblical verse from Matthew about separating the wheat from the chaff. Edmund often gestured toward it during his sermons as a symbol of divine judgment, never imagining that it would become the instrument of his own reckoning. Sofia's transformation from victim to avenger began not in a moment of rage, but through years of careful observation that revealed the systematic nature of Edmund Caldwell's crimes against both divine law and human decency. Born in New Orleans to a mother whose French heritage had given her a musical gift that Sofia inherited, she had been sold to the Caldwells at age 14 for $800, a transaction recorded in the same ledger where Edmund documented his cotton profits and charitable donations to Mobile's Methodist Church. The Caldwell plantation operated under a veneer of Christian respectability that fooled Mobile's social elite but couldn't hide its true nature from those forced to endure its daily realities. Edmund Caldwell at 52 had built his reputation as a godly plantation owner who treated his enslaved workforce with Christian kindness, a facade maintained through careful public relations and the strategic elimination of anyone who might contradict his carefully crafted image. His wife Miriam, 45, played the role of the pious plantation mistress while actively participating in psychological torments that would have shocked even hardened overseers. Jeremiah Caldwell, the eldest son at 24, served as the plantation's primary overseer, and had inherited his father's talent for disguising cruelty as moral instruction. His methods included forcing enslaved people to memorize Bible verses while being whipped, a practice he claimed would save their souls while breaking their bodies. Isaiah, the younger son at 21, managed the plantation's financial operations with the same methodical precision he applied to designing new forms of punishment that left no visible marks but caused maximum psychological damage. Mobile County records from 1839, discovered in the basement of the courthouse during renovation work in 1987, reveal the scope of the Caldwell operation that extended far beyond simple cotton farming. The plantation maintained 52 enslaved people with a total assessed value of $41,600, but the true measure of Edmund's wealth lay in his network of business relationships with shipping companies, slave traders, and corrupt officials who facilitated operations that generated over $85,000 annually in cotton exports alone. Sofia occupied a unique position within the system that made her both valuable and dangerous to the Caldwell family's continued success. Her musical abilities, inherited from her Creole mother, made her useful for entertaining guests and providing accompaniment during Edmund's religious services. Her literacy, acquired through careful observation of the Caldwell children's lessons, allowed her to assist with plantation correspondence and record keeping. Most dangerously, her intelligence and empathy made her the unofficial leader among the enslaved community, someone who could inspire resistance if she ever chose to act on the mounting evidence of systematic crimes she witnessed daily. The morning prayer ritual that would become the setting for Edmund Caldwell's final sermon had been instituted shortly after Sofia's arrival in 1835, ostensibly as a way to provide spiritual guidance to the plantation's enslaved workforce. In reality, these daily gatherings served as opportunities for psychological control that went far beyond anything required by Alabama's slave codes. Edmund used these sessions to demonstrate his absolute power over not just the bodies but the souls of the people he owned, forcing them to participate in religious exercises that mocked their humanity while reinforcing their subjugation. Each morning at 5 o'clock, before the sun had fully risen over the Tensaw River, Sofia would ring the plantation bell that summoned all household staff and field hands to the mansion's parlor for what Edmund called devotional instruction. The forced gathering included children as young as 6, elderly people whose bodies had been broken by decades of labor, pregnant women who could barely stand, and anyone else who could physically make the walk to the main house. Absence from morning prayer was considered rebellion and punished accordingly. Sofia's role in these ceremonies had evolved from simple attendance to active participation that made her complicit in her own oppression and that of her fellow enslaved people. Edmund had discovered her literacy during her second year on the plantation and began forcing her to read scripture aloud, particularly passages that he interpreted as divine endorsement of slavery. Her clear voice and obvious intelligence made these readings more effective propaganda than anything Edmund could deliver himself, a fact that both pleased and disturbed him. The psychological torture of being forced to read biblical passages justifying her own bondage while watching the faces of people she cared about was compounded by Edmund's habit of requiring her to explain the meaning of particularly inflammatory verses. When she read from Ephesians about slaves obeying their masters, Edmund would make her elaborate on why God had ordained their situation. When she read from Leviticus about the children of strangers being bondmen forever, he would ask her to confirm that Scripture proved the righteousness of their permanent enslavement. These morning sessions revealed the extent to which Edmund had corrupted Christian doctrine to serve his own purposes, transforming religious instruction into a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to break the spirits of people who might otherwise resist their circumstances. His sermons combined genuine biblical scholarship with twisted interpretations that portrayed slavery as divinely mandated and resistance as sinful rebellion against God's will. The effect on his captive audience was devastating, creating a spiritual crisis that went beyond physical oppression to attack the very foundation of human dignity and hope. Sofia's documentation of Edmund's crimes began accidentally during her third year on the plantation when she discovered that the family Bible used for morning prayers contained blank pages at the back where previous owners had recorded births, deaths, and significant events. Her initial entries were simple observations about inconsistencies between Edmund's public pronouncements and private actions, but gradually evolved into systematic documentation of crimes that violated both civil law and basic human decency. The hollowed-out prayer book where Sofia kept her real records had been created through
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
months of careful work, removing pages from a damaged hymnal and replacing them with sheets of paper she had stolen from Edmund's study. Her entries used a code based on musical notation that she had developed, allowing her to document specific incidents while disguising the information as song arrangements. To anyone examining the book casually, it appeared to contain nothing more than spiritual songs and hymns appropriate for an enslaved person to possess. Sofia's records revealed a pattern of systematic murder that Edmund had been concealing for over a decade through carefully staged accidents and false medical documentation provided by Dr. Nathan Whitmore, Mobile's corrupt county medical examiner. At least 16 enslaved people had died from punishments that were actually executions designed to eliminate potential troublemakers while maintaining Edmund's reputation as a Christian plantation owner who would never deliberately harm his valuable property. A coded entry from September 1837 documented one of the most shocking incidents Sophia had witnessed during her time at the plantation. Old Samuel had been caught teaching children to read using Bible verses, a crime that Edmund declared tantamount to theft since literacy increased an enslaved person's value and therefore represented unauthorized appropriation of Caldwell property. Edmund's punishment involved forcing Samuel into what he called a confession session in the locked room behind the parlor, where the old man was required to admit his sins while being systematically tortured with methods that Edmund claimed were based on biblical precedents for divine justice. Samuel's death 3 days later was attributed to heart failure brought on by advanced age and the shock of spiritual conviction according to Dr. Whitmore's official report. Sophia's coded documentation revealed that the old man had actually been beaten to death with a leather strap while being forced to recite scripture about the proper place of servants, his body then positioned to suggest natural causes. The doctor's examination was perfunctory, consisting of a brief visual inspection that ignored obvious signs of trauma in favor of a predetermined conclusion that protected Edmund's reputation. The murder of Samuel marked a turning point in Sophia's understanding of her situation and her determination to document evidence that might someday serve as testimony against the systematic crimes being committed under the guise of Christian plantation management. Her subsequent entries became more detailed and precise, recording dates, witnesses, methods and outcomes with the thoroughness of someone who understood that documentation might be the only form of justice available to people whom the law refused to protect. Sophia's investigation revealed that Edmund's crimes extended far beyond individual acts of violence to encompass a sophisticated network of corruption that included local law enforcement, medical authorities, and religious leaders who provided cover for activities that would have been considered criminal even by the loose standards of antebellum Alabama. The Caldwell plantation operated essentially as a murder site where inconvenient people could be eliminated with complete legal impunity while maintaining the facade of Christian respectability that protected Edmund's social and political position. Reverend Marcus Hayes of Mobile's First Methodist Church had been providing spiritual endorsement for Edmund's methods since 1834, visiting the plantation quarterly to witness morning prayer sessions and publicly praising Edmund's commitment to bringing Christian instruction to his enslaved workforce. The Reverend's written testimonials, copies of which Sophia discovered in Edmund's correspondence files, described the Caldwell plantation as a model of Christian slave management that other plantation owners should emulate. These endorsements carried particular weight because Reverend Hayes enjoyed a reputation throughout Alabama as a moral authority on the proper treatment of enslaved people, someone whose approval could legitimize practices that might otherwise be questioned by more squeamish plantation owners. His visits to the Caldwell plantation were carefully choreographed events where the most brutal aspects of daily life were hidden, while scripted demonstrations of contentment and gratitude were performed by enslaved people who understood that their survival depended on maintaining the illusion of Christian harmony. Sophia's musical abilities made her a central figure in these performances, required to lead hymn singing and provide piano accompaniment for religious services that portrayed the plantation as a place where Christian masters and grateful slaves lived in harmonious accordance with divine will. Psychological damage of being forced to participate in these elaborate deceptions while knowing the reality of daily life under Edmund's rule contributed to her growing determination to find some way to expose the truth about what was happening behind the Caldwell plantation's facade of respectability. The breaking point came during the winter of 1838 when Edmund implemented what he called enhanced spiritual instruction for enslaved people who showed signs of discontent or resistance. These sessions, conducted in the locked room behind the parlor, combined physical torture with forced recitation of Bible verses about the divine ordination of slavery and the sinfulness of rebellion against earthly masters. Sophia was required to assist with these sessions, reading scripture while Edmund applied his enhanced techniques to ensure maximum spiritual benefit. The enhanced instruction killed 4 people between December 1838 and February 1839, each death carefully staged to appear as the result of spiritual conviction that had overwhelmed individuals whose bodies were already weakened by the rigors of plantation life. Dr. Whitmore's examinations continued to support whatever explanation Edmund provided, creating an official record that portrayed the plantation as a place where the spiritual intensity of Christian instruction sometimes proved too powerful for enslaved people whose moral development had been stunted by generations of heathen influence. Sofia's coded documentation of these murders included details that revealed the calculated nature of Edmund's methodology and his conscious awareness that he was committing crimes that exceeded even slavery's brutal legal boundaries. Her records showed that he selected victims based on their potential to influence other enslaved people, eliminating natural leaders and anyone whose intelligence or moral authority might challenge his absolute control over the plantation community. The most disturbing aspect of Sofia's evidence was Edmund's increasing confidence that his network of corrupt officials and religious authorities would protect him from any consequences regardless of how extreme his methods became. Letters she copied from his correspondence revealed plans to expand his enhanced spiritual instruction techniques to other plantations, essentially franchising his system of disguised murder to plantation owners throughout the Deep South who were struggling with what they termed discipline problems among their enslaved workforces. By March 1839, Sofia realized that documenting Edmund's crimes was no longer sufficient to serve any meaningful purpose. Her evidence would die with her unless she acted to preserve both the records and herself, and Edmund's growing confidence suggested that her own name was likely to appear on his list of candidates for enhanced spiritual instruction. The morning prayer ritual that had served as the setting for so much psychological torment would provide the perfect opportunity for justice if she could find the courage to claim it. The ceremonial hatchet mounted above the parlor fireplace represented both symbolic and practical opportunity for someone who had been forced to listen to Edmund's twisted sermons about divine judgment and the separation of wheat from chaff. His habit of gesturing toward the weapon while delivering these spiritual lessons had made Sofia intimately familiar with its weight balance and the simple mechanism that secured it to its mounting brackets. More importantly, the morning prayer schedule meant that Edmund would be alone with his captive audience, separated from the overseers and field hands who might otherwise intervene to protect him. Sofia's plan crystallized during the first week of March as she observed Edmund's preparations for what he announced would be a special Lenten devotion featuring enhanced spiritual instruction for several enslaved people whose recent behavior suggested insufficient appreciation for Christian guidance. Her own name appeared on the list of participants, confirming her suspicion that Edmund had identified her as a potential threat requiring elimination through his enhanced techniques. The irony of using Edmund's own ceremonial weapon to deliver justice during a perverted religious service appealed to Sofia's sense of moral symmetry, but her decision was based on practical rather than poetic considerations. The hatchet was the most effective weapon within her reach. The morning prayer provided the best opportunity for action, and her detailed knowledge of Edmund's habits and the plantation's layout gave her the tactical advantages necessary for success and escape. March 15 dawned gray and humid, with fog rising from the Tensas River to shroud the plantation in mist that would provide perfect cover for someone who needed to move quickly and quietly through familiar terrain toward the freedom that lay somewhere beyond Alabama's borders. Sofia lit the candles in the parlor as she had done every morning for 4 years, arranged the chairs where 52 people would gather to participate in their own spiritual degradation, and prepared for the morning prayer that would finally deliver justice to the Caldwell plantation through methods that Edmund himself had taught her to understand. Part 2. The Central Image. The sound that shattered the pre-dawn silence on March 15, 1839 was not the familiar crack of a whip or the hollow thud of flesh against wood, but something far more decisive and permanent. The ceremonial hatchet that had gleamed above Edmund Caldwell's fireplace for 15 years descended with the precision of divine judgment, guided by hands that had been forced to polish its steel blade every Sunday after morning worship. The Turkish carpet beneath Edmund's knees darkened with more than morning dew as his final prayer was answered not by the God he claimed to serve but by the human being he had systematically tortured in his name. Sofia stood in the parlor's golden lamplight, her calloused fingers still gripping the oak handle, while 51 pairs of eyes witnessed the moment when victim became executor and morning devotion transformed into final reckoning. The family Bible lay open to Exodus chapter 21, its pages displaying verses about masters who strike their servants, while the grandfather clock in the corner marked 6:17 in the morning, the exact moment when justice finally found its way to a plantation where God's word had been perverted into justification for unspeakable cruelties. The silence that followed was profound and complete, broken only by the distant sound of roosters calling from the quarters and the gentle lapping of Tensaw River water against the plantation dock. Sofia had planned for this moment through months of careful observation, but nothing had prepared her for the absolute stillness that followed Edmund Caldwell's final attempt to quote scripture while blood spread across the imported carpet his cotton profits had purchased. The ceremonial hatchet felt lighter in her hands than it had appeared mounted above the fireplace, its weight somehow diminished now that it had fulfilled the purpose its inscription had always promised. The morning light streaming through the parlor's tall windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air above Edmund's motionless form, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that seemed to mock the pompous religious ceremonies that had taken place in this room every dawn for the past 4 years. Sofia realized that she was witnessing more than individual death but the collapse of an entire system of spiritual oppression that had relied on twisted biblical interpretation to maintain control over human souls as well as bodies. The other enslaved people in the room remained frozen in their assigned chairs, unsure whether to flee, celebrate, or simply continue the morning prayer ritual as if nothing had changed. Their confusion reflected the psychological damage that years of forced religious participation had inflicted, creating a mental paralysis that made it difficult to process the reality that their tormentor would never again force them to sing hymns while he planned their deaths. Sofia understood that her action had liberated more than just herself but had broken a cycle of spiritual terrorism that had trapped 52 human beings in a web of perverted Christianity designed to make them complicit in their own destruction. The weight of what she had accomplished began to settle on Sofia's shoulders as she looked around the parlor where so many morning prayers had become instruments of psychological torture. The mahogany furniture imported from distant lands, the crystal chandelier that had witnessed countless forced confessions, the religious paintings depicting biblical scenes of suffering and redemption all seemed different now, transformed from symbols of oppression into evidence of a system that had finally encountered someone willing to challenge its fundamental assumptions about power, submission, and divine will. Sofia's transformation from victim to agent of justice had not happened in a single moment of rage but through years of careful documentation and growing understanding of the systematic nature of Edmund's crimes against both civil law and Christian doctrine. Her action represented not random violence but calculated response to documented atrocities that had exceeded even slavery's brutal legal boundaries, making her deed less murder than execution of judgment that no earthly court would ever deliver. The blood spreading across the Turkish carpet created patterns that seemed to Sofia like musical notation appropriate given her hidden documentation system that had used coded musical arrangements to record Edmund's crimes over the past 2 years. The irony was not lost on her that the man who had forced her to sing hymns while he planned enhanced spiritual instruction for other enslaved people would die in silence, his final sermon interrupted before he could begin another day of using God's word as justification for systematic murder. Part 3. Environmental foundation. The Caldwell plantation house stood like a monument to contradiction on the banks of the Tensaw River where Spanish moss draped ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of human suffering disguised as Christian stewardship. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine and honeysuckle from carefully maintained gardens that enslaved hands had planted and tended, their beauty serving as camouflage for horrors that occurred daily within the mansion's elegant walls. The contrast between external appearance and internal reality reflected the broader deception that allowed Southern society to maintain its self-image as Christian civilization while perpetrating systematic atrocities against human beings created in God's image. Mobile's position as Alabama's primary cotton port had made the Caldwell plantation a crucial link in the economic chain that connected Alabama cotton fields to textile mills in New England and European markets hungry for the raw materials that enslaved labor produced. The Tensaw River provided direct access to Mobile Bay and the Gulf of Mexico, allowing Edmund to ship his cotton directly to international buyers without relying on intermediary merchants who might ask uncomfortable questions about production methods or labor practices. The plantation's 2,800 acres encompassed some of the richest soil in Baldwin County, land that had been taken from Creek Indians during the conflicts that followed the War of 1812 and distributed to white settlers who promised to develop it according to Christian principles and American ideals of progress and civilization. The irony that this stolen land was now being worked by stolen people under a system that perverted Christian doctrine to justify both forms of theft was lost on Edmund Caldwell, who genuinely believed that God had ordained his prosperity as reward for his faithful stewardship of inferior races who required firm guidance to achieve their proper place in divine creation. The mansion itself reflected Edmund's desire to project an image of refined Christian gentility that would impress Mobile's social elite and northern business partners who might otherwise question the sources of his wealth. The Greek Revival architecture with its massive white columns and expansive porches suggested classical virtue and democratic ideals, while the interior featured imported furnishings and artwork that demonstrated Edmund's cultural sophistication and commitment to bringing civilization to Alabama's frontier regions. The parlor where morning prayers were conducted occupied the heart of the mansion, positioned to overlook both the slave quarters and the cotton fields where Edmund's wealth was produced. The room's large windows provided excellent sightlines that allowed Edmund to monitor his property even while conducting religious services, reinforcing his message that divine authority and earthly power were inseparably linked in the proper order of Christian plantation management. The religious artwork that dominated the parlor's walls had been carefully selected to reinforce Edmund's theological justifications for slavery while providing visual support for his twisted interpretations of biblical passages about servants, masters, and divine hierarchy. Paintings depicting the curse of Ham, the Tower of Babel, and other Old Testament scenes provided convenient talking points for sermons that portrayed racial slavery as divinely ordained punishment for ancient sins that could only be ameliorated through faithful service to Christian masters who would guide enslaved souls toward eventual salvation. The slave quarters that housed 52 human beings occupied a carefully planned arrangement that maximized surveillance while minimizing the possibility of organized resistance or escape attempts. The buildings were positioned within easy view of the mansion's windows and arranged in rows that prevented private gatherings or communication between quarters without detection. Each building housed multiple families in conditions designed to provide just enough comfort to maintain productivity while ensuring that inhabitants understood their complete dependence on Edmund's benevolence for survival. The cotton fields that generated the plantation's wealth stretched toward the horizon in precisely planted rows that represented thousands of hours of human labor performed under conditions that violated every principle of Christian charity, while generating profits that Edmund interpreted as divine blessing on his faithful stewardship. The sight of these fields from the mansion's windows provided constant reminder of the source of Caldwell prosperity and the human cost of maintaining their position among Mobile's planter elite. The Tensaw River that bordered the plantation served multiple purposes in Edmund's operation, providing transportation for cotton shipments, power for the gristmill that processed grain for both human and animal consumption, and convenient disposal method for evidence of crimes that exceeded even Alabama's generous tolerance for plantation discipline. The river's current carried away more than agricultural waste, ensuring that certain aspects of Caldwell plantation management remained invisible to authorities who might otherwise interfere with Edmund's enhanced spiritual instruction techniques. The natural environment surrounding the plantation reflected the larger contradiction between divine creation's beauty and human corruption that characterized the entire antebellum South. Ancient cypress trees draped with Spanish moss created cathedral-like spaces that should have inspired reverence for God's handiwork, but instead provided cover for activities that violated every principle of Christian morality while being justified through perverted biblical interpretation. Mobile's urban environment provided crucial support for Edmund's operation through networks of corrupt officials, compliant merchants, and sympathetic religious leaders who shared his theological justifications for systematic oppression. The city's position as an international port brought together diverse populations and economic interests that created opportunities for discreet business arrangements with few questions asked about methods or sources. The broader Alabama political environment in 1839 actively encouraged the kind of innovative plantation management that Edmund had developed, with state legislators regularly debating ways to improve slave discipline and prevent the kind of resistance that had erupted in Virginia during Nat Turner's rebellion 8 years earlier. Edmund's methods were viewed by many as models that should be studied and replicated throughout the Deep South as solutions to ongoing problems with enslaved people who failed to appreciate the benefits of Christian civilization. The international context that surrounded the Caldwell plantation included growing abolitionist pressure from British authorities who had recently abolished slavery in their Caribbean colonies and were using their naval power to suppress the international slave trade. This external pressure made Edmund's theological justifications for slavery increasingly important as Southern planters sought moral and intellectual arguments that could counter abolitionist propaganda while maintaining Northern business relationships essential to cotton marketing. Part 4. Protagonist Introduction. Sofia's journey from the slave markets of New Orleans to the morning prayer rituals of the Caldwell plantation had transformed her from a 14-year-old girl with musical dreams into an 18-year-old woman whose intelligence posed an existential threat to everything Edmund Caldwell claimed to believe about racial hierarchy and divine ordination. Her survival through 4 years of systematic psychological torture while maintaining her sanity and moral clarity marked her as fundamentally different from other enslaved people who had either been broken by Edmund's methods or eliminated through his enhanced spiritual instruction techniques. The transaction that brought Sofia to Mobile in 1835 had been recorded in Edmund's plantation ledger with the same clinical precision he used to document cotton yields and equipment purchases, but the numbers failed to capture the significance of what he was acquiring. Captain James Morrison, the slave trader who negotiated the sale, had warned Edmund that this particular girl possessed unusual intelligence and musical ability that made her valuable but potentially dangerous if not properly managed. The $800 Edmund paid represented a significant investment that he expected to recover through Sofia's contributions to both plantation productivity and the carefully orchestrated religious performances that maintained his reputation among Mobile's social elite. Sofia's musical abilities had been evident from her earliest childhood in New Orleans, where her mother's French Creole heritage had provided access to cultural influences that most enslaved people never experienced. Her natural talent for piano, voice, and musical composition had developed through informal lessons and careful observation of free black musicians who performed in New Orleans' complex social environment where racial boundaries were more fluid than in other southern cities. This musical education had given Sofia not just technical skills but a broader understanding of cultural possibilities that existed beyond the narrow confines of plantation life. The literacy that made Sofia so valuable and dangerous to Edmund had been acquired through years of careful observation and practice that went undetected until her second year on the plantation. Her ability to read and write represented more than simple technical skill but reflected intellectual curiosity and determination that no amount of systematic oppression had been able to suppress. Edmund's discovery of her literacy had led to her forced participation in morning prayer rituals as someone who could effectively communicate his theological justifications to other enslaved people in ways that his own sermons could never achieve. Sofia's position as unofficial leader among the Caldwell plantation's enslaved community had developed naturally through her combination of intelligence, empathy, and moral courage that made others look to her for guidance and support. Her ability to maintain hope and dignity while enduring Edmund's psychological torture provided inspiration for people who might otherwise have been broken by the systematic cruelties they witnessed daily. This leadership role made her particularly dangerous in Edmund's estimation and eventually led to her inclusion on his list of candidates for enhanced spiritual instruction. The hidden journal where Sofia documented Edmund's crimes represented the culmination of 2 years of careful observation and systematic evidence gathering that revealed the true extent of his violations of both civil law and Christian doctrine. Her coded entries used musical notation to disguise information that could have resulted in immediate execution if discovered, demonstrating both intellectual sophistication and understanding of the need for operational security when challenging systematic oppression. The evidence she compiled documented not just individual atrocities but patterns of behavior that revealed Edmund's conscious awareness of his criminal activities and his confidence that corrupt officials would protect him from consequences. Sofia's transformation from victim to potential avenger had occurred gradually through accumulated exposure to horrors that would have broken weaker spirits while simultaneously revealing the systematic nature of Edmund's crimes and the complete absence of legal protection for his victims. Her growing understanding that documentation would be meaningless without action to preserve both the evidence and herself had led to careful planning that took advantage of her unique position within the plantation's daily routines and her intimate knowledge of Edmund's habits and vulnerabilities. The musical code that Sofia had developed for documenting Edmund's crimes reflected both her creative intelligence and her understanding that survival required constant adaptation to circumstances that could change without warning. Her ability to disguise evidence as innocent musical arrangements demonstrated the kind of mental agility that had allowed her to maintain her sanity while being forced to participate in religious rituals designed to break her spirit and make her complicit in her own oppression. Sofia's relationship with other enslaved people on the plantation had been complicated by her forced participation in Edmund's morning prayer rituals and her visible favor as someone whose musical abilities made her valuable for entertaining guests and providing religious accompaniment. Some viewed her with suspicion as someone who had collaborated with their oppressor, while others understood that her position provided opportunities for gathering intelligence that could benefit the entire community if circumstances ever allowed for organized resistance. The psychological damage that Sofia had endured through 4 years of forced religious participation while knowing the reality behind Edmund's facade of Christian respectability had been offset by her growing certainty that what she was planning was not just justified but morally required by the same biblical principles that Edmund perverted to justify his crimes. Her deep personal faith had provided strength to endure systematic spiritual abuse while maintaining clarity about the difference between genuine Christianity and the twisted theology that Edmund used to disguise systematic murder. Sofia's preparation for action had included not just tactical planning but spiritual preparation that allowed her to understand her potential deed as execution of divine justice rather than murder, a distinction that would prove crucial to maintaining her sanity and moral clarity during and after the events of March 15. Her ability to frame resistance within religious context reflected both her theological sophistication and her understanding that challenging Edmund's authority required more than physical courage but spiritual certainty that God would judge her actions according to justice rather than human law. Part 5. Character distinction. Sofia's intellectual capabilities had manifested themselves in ways that went far beyond simple literacy or musical talent to encompass a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, religious doctrine, and social dynamics that made her uniquely dangerous to the entire system of plantation control that Edmund Caldwell had spent decades perfecting. Her ability to analyze and understand the motivations behind systematic oppression while maintaining emotional equilibrium under extreme psychological pressure marked her as fundamentally different from other enslaved people who had either been broken by similar treatment or eliminated before they could develop effective resistance strategies. The musical gifts that Sofia had inherited from her Creole mother represented more than entertainment value or religious accompaniment but provided her with cognitive tools that enhanced her ability to process complex information, recognize patterns, and develop creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Her understanding of musical composition, harmony, and rhythm had translated into broader analytical skills that allowed her to decode the underlying structures of oppression while developing systematic approaches to documentation and resistance that other people might never have conceived. Sofia's multilingual abilities reflected the cosmopolitan background that distinguished her from other enslaved people who had been born into plantation isolation without exposure to the broader cultural influences that shaped her intellectual development. Her fluency in English, French, and rudimentary Choctaw had been acquired through different phases of her life and provided her with communication tools that proved invaluable for gathering intelligence, building relationships, and eventually planning escape routes that took advantage of Mobile's diverse population and international connections. The theological sophistication that Sofia had developed through forced participation in Edmund's morning prayer rituals had given her detailed knowledge of biblical interpretation and Christian doctrine that exceeded the religious education available to most free white people in antebellum Alabama. Her ability to recognize the differences between authentic Christianity and Edmund's perverted theology had provided both intellectual framework for resistance and spiritual justification for actions that might otherwise have been impossible for someone with deep religious convictions to contemplate. Sofia's psychological resilience had been tested through systematic exposure to horrors designed specifically to break spirits and destroy hope. Yet she had maintained not just sanity but moral clarity that allowed her to distinguish between justice and revenge while planning actions that would require extraordinary personal courage. Her ability to witness systematic murder, torture, and spiritual abuse while maintaining emotional equilibrium and clear thinking demonstrated mental strength that Edmund had completely failed to recognize despite 4 years of daily interaction. The leadership qualities that made Sofia influential among other enslaved people reflected not just intelligence or courage but empathy and moral authority that had been forged through shared suffering and demonstrated commitment to principles that transcended personal survival. Her willingness to risk her own safety to document crimes against others and her ability to provide hope and guidance to people facing impossible circumstances had established her as someone whose opinions and decisions carried weight throughout the plantation community. Sofia's understanding of legal and social systems had been acquired through careful observation of Edmund's business dealings, correspondence with local officials, and interactions with visiting planters who discussed regional political developments during their stays at the plantation. Her ability to analyze these conversations and recognize patterns of corruption and conspiracy had provided crucial intelligence about the networks that protected Edmund from accountability while revealing potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and determination. The strategic thinking that Sofia had developed through years of navigating impossible circumstances while maintaining her principles and protecting others demonstrated intellectual capabilities that challenged every assumption about racial inferiority that Edmund used to justify his treatment of enslaved people. Her ability to plan complex operations while maintaining operational security under constant surveillance proved that systematic oppression had failed to suppress cognitive abilities that Edmund's theological framework claimed were impossible for people of African descent to possess. Sofia's artistic sensibilities had provided her with aesthetic frameworks for understanding beauty, harmony, and moral order that allowed her to recognize the fundamental ugliness of Edmund's system while maintaining appreciation for divine creation that systematic abuse could not destroy. Her ability to find meaning and purpose through creative expression had sustained her spirit during periods when physical survival seemed impossible and had contributed to her development of coded documentation systems that protected crucial evidence while serving as outlets for emotions that could not safely be expressed directly. The emotional intelligence that Sofia had developed through constant exposure to extreme psychological manipulation had given her sophisticated understanding of human motivation and behavior that proved invaluable for predicting Edmund's actions, managing relationships with other enslaved people, and eventually planning resistance activities that required precise timing and careful coordination. Her ability to read people's emotional states and intentions had been honed through years of survival in an environment where misreading signals could result in death. Sofia's moral development had occurred through constant confrontation with systematic evil that forced her to develop clear ethical frameworks for distinguishing between right and wrong under circumstances where conventional moral guidance provided no useful direction. Her ability to maintain principles while adapting to impossible circumstances had been tested through forced participation in activities that violated her deepest convictions, yet she had emerged with stronger rather than weaker commitment to justice and human dignity. The practical skills that Sofia had acquired through 4 years of plantation life had given her detailed knowledge of agriculture, household management, mechanical systems, and natural environments that would prove crucial for survival during and after her planned resistance activities. Her understanding of local geography, seasonal patterns, transportation networks, and potential allies had been systematically developed through careful observation and strategic questioning that prepared her for possibilities that she hoped would never become necessary. Sofia's capacity for long-term planning and strategic thinking had been demonstrated through her systematic documentation project and her careful preparation for potential resistance activities that required months of intelligence gathering, resource accumulation, and psychological preparation. Her ability to maintain focus on distant goals while managing immediate survival challenges reflected intellectual discipline that Edmund's system had been designed to prevent but had completely failed to suppress. Part 6. System exposition: the intricate machinery of oppression that Edmund Caldwell had constructed over 15 years of plantation management operated through layers of deception so sophisticated that even those who benefited from its profits remained largely ignorant of the systematic crimes that generated their prosperity. Mobile County tax records from 1839 reveal the Caldwell plantation's official valuation at $180,000, making it the third most valuable agricultural property in Baldwin County. But these public documents concealed the true sources of profitability that extended far beyond conventional cotton farming into areas that would have horrified even slavery's most ardent defenders. Edmund's financial success derived from multiple revenue streams that took advantage of Alabama's loose regulatory environment and Mobile's position as an international port where few questions were asked about cargo origins or labor practices. The plantation's cotton production generated approximately $60,000 annually through direct sales to textile manufacturers in Manchester and Liverpool, but this legitimate income was supplemented by profits from activities that violated both state law and federal statutes governing interstate commerce and human beings. The breeding operation that Edmund had established in 1832 produced children who were sold to buyers throughout the Deep South, generating additional income that plantation ledgers disguised as livestock sales to avoid attracting attention from federal authorities who occasionally investigated suspected violations of laws restricting the domestic slave trade. Sofia's coded documentation revealed that at least 47 children had been born on the plantation since 1835, with 31 subsequently sold to buyers in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas territories where demand for young workers exceeded local supply. Dr. Nathan Whitmore's participation in Edmund's operation extended beyond providing false death certificates to encompass a sophisticated medical fraud scheme that generated income through insurance claims on enslaved people whose deaths had been deliberately caused through enhanced spiritual instruction techniques. The doctor's official reports consistently attributed fatalities to natural causes or accidents, allowing Edmund to collect insurance payments while eliminating individuals whose intelligence or leadership potential posed threats to plantation discipline. The insurance fraud that Dr. Whitmore facilitated had generated over $12,000 in fraudulent claims since 1836, according to correspondence that Sofia discovered while cleaning Edmund's study. The letters between Edmund and representatives of Hartford Insurance Company revealed a systematic pattern of false reporting that had attracted no scrutiny because the claimed causes of death appeared consistent with the hazards of plantation life and the supposed physical frailties of enslaved people who lacked proper Christian guidance. Edmund's relationship with Captain James Morrison extended beyond occasional slave purchases to encompass a partnership in smuggling operations that brought contraband goods through Mobile Bay while carrying human cargo to buyers who preferred to avoid the scrutiny that legal slave markets might attract. The captain's ship, the Magnolia Belle, made regular visits to the Caldwell plantation dock under cover of cotton shipments, but Sofia's observations revealed that outbound cargo often included human beings whose disappearances from plantation records were explained as runaways or deaths from natural causes. The political protection that allowed Edmund's operation to function without interference came through carefully cultivated relationships with local officials whose cooperation was secured through a combination of financial incentives and ideological alignment around shared beliefs about racial hierarchy and Christian civilization. Judge Harrison Mitchell, who presided over Baldwin County's circuit court, had received substantial loans from Edmund to finance his own plantation purchases, creating conflicts of interest that ensured favorable legal treatment for any disputes that might arise from Caldwell business practices. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford's enforcement of fugitive slave laws had been enhanced through Edmund's financial contributions to the Sheriff's Department Equipment Fund and his provision of tracking dogs that were used throughout Baldwin County to pursue escapees from various plantations. The sheriff's reports consistently praised Edmund's plantation management techniques and recommended his methods to other planters struggling with discipline problems among their enslaved workforces. The religious legitimacy that protected Edmund from moral criticism had been carefully constructed through strategic relationships with influential ministers whose theological interpretations provided intellectual justification for practices that might otherwise trouble Christian consciences. Reverend Marcus Hayes of First Methodist Church had been a regular recipient of Edmund's charitable donations and had developed sophisticated biblical arguments defending slavery as divinely ordained institution that served God's plan for civilizing inferior races through Christian guidance. Reverend Hayes's published sermons, which were distributed throughout Alabama and neighboring states, frequently cited the Caldwell plantation as an example of proper Christian slave management where enslaved people received spiritual instruction that prepared them for eventual salvation while contributing to the economic prosperity that God had blessed upon faithful stewards. These endorsements carried particular weight because the Reverend enjoyed a reputation as a moderate voice who advocated humane treatment within the framework of perpetual bondage. The network of corruption that protected Edmund's operation included business relationships with shipping companies, cotton factors, and international buyers who profited from plantation products while maintaining plausible ignorance about production methods. Mobile's commercial elite had developed sophisticated mechanisms for avoiding uncomfortable questions about labor practices as long as cotton shipments arrived on schedule and quality standards were maintained. Hartwell & Sons Cotton Factors, Edmund's primary business partner in Mobile, had built their reputation on discretion and efficiency that attracted planters throughout the region who preferred not to have their methods scrutinized too closely. The company's records, which Sofia had observed during her occasional trips to Mobile accompanying Edmund on business, revealed financial relationships with plantations throughout Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia that suggested systematic coordination among planters who shared similar management philosophies. The international dimension of Edmund's operation included direct relationships with British textile manufacturers who had developed preferences for cotton produced under what they termed traditional management systems that maintained quality through proper discipline and spiritual guidance. These buyers paid premium prices for cotton that was guaranteed to come from plantations where Christian principles governed relationships between masters and servants according to biblical precedents. The technological innovations that Edmund had developed for maximizing productivity while maintaining control included mechanical devices for punishment that were designed to cause maximum pain while avoiding visible damage that might attract unwanted attention from visitors or business associates. Sofia's documentation included detailed descriptions of equipment that Edmund had designed in collaboration with local blacksmiths who created specialized tools for what he called corrective instruction. The plantation's physical layout had been carefully planned to facilitate surveillance while preventing communication between different groups of enslaved people who might otherwise coordinate resistance activities. The positioning of buildings, work areas, and living quarters created sightlines that allowed overseers to monitor all activities while ensuring that gatherings of more than 3 people would be immediately detected and dispersed before dangerous conversations could develop. The daily routines that governed plantation life had been designed to maximize psychological control through constant uncertainty about schedules, assignments, and expectations that kept enslaved people focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning or resistance activities. Edmund's management system deliberately created unpredictable conditions that made it impossible for people to develop consistent relationships or coordinate activities that might challenge his authority. The communication systems that Edmund had established for coordinating with other plantations included regular correspondence with planters throughout the region who shared information about effective discipline techniques, potential security threats, and methods for preventing the kind of organized resistance that had erupted in other states. These letters, which Sofia had transcribed as part of her secretarial duties, revealed the existence of informal networks that coordinated plantation security measures across state boundaries. The legal framework that protected Edmund's operation had been carefully constructed through lobbying efforts that influenced state legislation governing slave codes and enforcement mechanisms. His financial contributions to political candidates had helped ensure that Alabama's laws provided maximum flexibility for plantation owners while minimizing opportunities for outside interference in what were considered private property matters between masters and their human chattels. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.